In the late autumn of 1851, Memphis stood at the height of its commercial power, its warehouses full, its streets crowded with merchants, and its reputation as a booming river city growing by the day. Cotton ships moved constantly along the Mississippi, carrying the wealth of the region, and the city's elite walked with the quiet arrogance of men convinced their prosperity would last forever. But beneath this polished surface lay ambitions, rivalries, and secrets deep enough to unsettle even the most secure households. It was in this atmosphere that a single event occurred, an event so strange, so unsettling, that the city's leading families would spend decades trying to erase it. The moment that would come to be whispered about for generations began not in a grand auction house or a bustling market, but in a cramped back office where a transaction took place that defied every known logic of the slave trade. A single young man, unnamed in official ledgers, unremarked upon in public notices, was sold at a price so extraordinary that it immediately circulated among merchants like a rumor too wild to be true. Even in a city where human lives were routinely appraised and priced, this sale stood apart. Within months, 3 of the wealthiest and most influential families in Memphis would collapse under the weight of their own decisions, their alliances shattered, their reputations stained. And within a year the buyer, a man accustomed to control and certainty, would vanish completely, leaving behind only scattered journal pages filled with warnings, half-finished thoughts, and the suggestion that he had stumbled onto something far more dangerous than a commercial transaction. City's newspaper archives from that period show puzzling absences, missing issues, erased columns, editorial gaps where entire weeks of reporting should exist. Historians later noted that these disappearances coincided precisely with the months following that infamous transaction, leading many to suspect that someone had gone to great effort to remove all traces of what occurred. Whether to protect reputations, conceal crimes, or suppress a scandal of unimaginable scale, the result was the same: public silence and private fear. To understand why this single sale had such a devastating impact, one must first understand the Memphis of that era. In 1851, the city was not only a center of commerce, but also one of the most active slave trading hubs in the Western Territories. Front Street, lined with white, columned buildings, served as the public showroom of this growing enterprise. Inside those halls, auctioneers recited prices in practiced tones, buyers inspected bodies with cold precision, and human beings were sorted like shipments. 3 families dominated this world, each holding influence over different sectors of Memphis commerce. Their rivalries were unspoken yet constant, their ambitions shaped by a relentless desire to outdo one another. These families, Harrington, Dalton, and Cavendish, moved through society with the confidence of people who had never been denied anything in their lives. They hosted competing dinners, invested in competing ventures, and quietly sought any opportunity to secure advantages over one another. It was into this world of polished civility and hidden scheming that the rumor first arrived. A traveling trader, Ambrose Fletcher, had come to Memphis with a slave. Unlike any the city had seen before, Fletcher was known for secrecy and for dealing in unusual merchandise, the kind that appealed to private collectors or eccentric buyers. But this time, he refused to show his acquisition publicly, refused to advertise, refused even to speak of the young man in his possession. His silence did more to stir the city's curiosity than any spectacle would have. The whispers that followed grew more elaborate with each telling. Some claimed the young man possessed a beauty so startling that grown men forgot their words upon seeing him. Others insisted his bearing resembled that of an educated gentleman rather than a slave. A few insisted he had an intelligence in his eyes that made even seasoned traders uneasy. Rumor layered upon rumor until the story took on an almost mythical quality, too strange to ignore yet too unbelievable to accept fully. For most, it remained a curiosity, an entertaining tale to share over drinks. But for one man, Charles Harrington, heir to one of the city's wealthiest families, the rumor became something else entirely, an opportunity, a chance to own something rare, something extraordinary, something that would elevate his family above their rivals. The more he heard, the more the idea took root. And so, driven by ambition and perhaps something deeper he did not yet recognize, Charles arranged a private viewing. What he saw that afternoon would alter the course of his life and the fate of every person connected to the three ruling families of Memphis. He left that room convinced he had made a bold and brilliant purchase. He could not have known that in doing so, he had stepped directly into the center of a hidden conflict, one involving forged identities, concealed histories, and a mother whose determination would shake the foundations of an entire city. It began with a single transaction. It would end with death, scandal, disappearance, and the unraveling of powerful dynasties. And at the center of it all stood one young man whose presence none of them fully understood. Rumors of the mysterious young man brought to Memphis by Ambrose Fletcher continued to spread quietly through the city, whispered in drawing rooms, muttered in clubs, and exchanged in low voices across polished, wooden tables where businessmen gathered to trade gossip disguised as intelligence. By early November, curiosity had sharpened into something far more urgent among the elite. And though Fletcher refused to display his acquisition publicly, his secrecy only deepened the sense that something extraordinary had arrived in the city. Most slave traders thrived on spectacle, public exhibitions, well-timed announcements, crowd-stirring previews meant to provoke bidding wars, yet Fletcher did the opposite. He took a room in an inexpensive boarding house far from the fashionable center of town, avoided the established auction houses, and declined every offer of private inquiry. His silence became an invitation for speculation. The whispers intensified when a tobacco merchant swore he had caught a fleeting glimpse of the young man on the riverfront, and described the encounter with such striking detail that even seasoned traders hesitated before dismissing it as drunken exaggeration. He spoke of features so symmetrical they appeared sculpted, eyes of shifting gray, green that seemed to follow movement with unsettling intelligence, and a posture that conveyed neither fear nor defiance but a calm awareness rare among men in bondage. Charles Harrington, who first heard this rumor during a card game, dismissed it outwardly, but found himself unable to let it go. The image of an unusually refined slave lingered in his mind like a challenge. His family prized appearances, and his father, Edmund Harrington, believed that every object and every person within their household reflected the dignity of their name. A slave of exceptional refinement would serve not merely as labor, but as a symbol of superiority, a living testament to the Harringtons' ability to obtain what others desired but could not acquire. As these thoughts took shape, Charles arranged discreet inquiries, soon learning that Fletcher intended to leave the city within the week, having failed to find a buyer willing to meet his astonishing asking price of $3,000. The number itself gave Charles pause. Such a price belonged to rare specialists or highly trained household slaves with verifiable backgrounds. That a single young man with no public history could command such a sum was either madness or proof of something genuinely singular. Compelled by a mixture of pride, curiosity, and the desire to outmaneuver the Dalton and Cavendish families, Charles secured a private appointment. He entered the dim boarding-house room prepared for disappointment, but Fletcher's demeanor, calm, guarded, almost triumphant, made Charles hesitate. The trader's insistence on full payment without bargaining seemed absurd until the moment he called for the young man to enter. What stepped through the adjoining door shifted the atmosphere instantly. The figure was tall, graceful, and composed, his presence as controlled as any well-raised gentleman, though his eyes remained lowered in practiced submission. Charles felt himself unsettled not by beauty alone, but by the sensation that this young man, despite his silence, was perfectly aware of the effect he produced. Everything about him, his posture, his unmarked hands, the faint refinement in his movements, suggested a background starkly different from the crude experiences typical of enslaved men. As Charles circled him, he sensed intelligence behind the downcast gaze, a quiet calculation that unsettled him precisely because it did not fit the world he understood. Fletcher spoke of skills, education, languages, and impeccable upbringing, but there was something in his tone that hinted at omissions, as though the truth lay beneath a varnish of carefully constructed details. Charles felt the weight of possibility settle onto him. A slave like this would elevate the Harrington household above all others. Yet a faint unease crept in, some awareness that the young man's silence concealed more than simple obedience. Despite this, Charles agreed to the purchase, convincing himself that the risk would be rewarded with admiration and envy from Memphis society. When he left the boarding house with arrangements settled, he believed he had acted boldly, perhaps brilliantly. But beneath his confidence, a faint thread of doubt tugged at him. He had the sense, not yet fear, but something close to it, that he had invited into his home not just an unusually valuable servant, but the beginning of a story he did not yet understand, one that would pull apart the polished fabric of Memphis society stitch by stitch. The transfer of ownership occurred the following afternoon in the office of Horace Pembroke, the Harrington family's long, trusted attorney, a man whose stern caution had prevented countless disputes among Memphis merchants. He examined the documents Fletcher presented with the meticulous care of someone who had seen forged bills of sale before, yet even he seemed faintly unsettled by the trader's unwavering confidence. The papers appeared legitimate. Names, signatures, seals, all consistent with the origins Fletcher claimed. The bill of sale traced back to a Virginia estate, and the accompanying letter, signed by a supposed Mrs. Eleanor Stratton, attested to the young man's refinement and service. Marcus, as he was called, stood silently throughout the proceedings, his expression smooth and unreadable, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the reach of the room. When the agreement was finalized and Fletcher departed with his payment, the Harringtons took Marcus to their estate on Union Avenue, a grand Greek Revival mansion built to impress anyone who approached its gleaming white columns. Charles expected his father to scold him for spending such a monstrous sum without permission, but Edmund's response when he first laid eyes on Marcus was an astonishment that quickly transformed into a fascination bordering on unease. The elder Harrington paced around the young man as though encountering a specimen he could not classify. Here was someone who moved with the ease of a well-educated clerk, who stood with the quiet formality of a trained attendant, yet whose features suggested a heritage more complex than simple description allowed. It took only minutes for Edmund to determine that Marcus should be placed not in the servants' quarters, but in a room near his own study, an unprecedented decision that unsettled the entire household. The staff, long accustomed to the rigid hierarchy of service, whispered among themselves, puzzled by a newcomer who spoke softly, moved with elegant restraint, and seemed unaffected by the heavy atmosphere of subservience that pervaded the estate. Bess, the experienced housekeeper, observed Marcus with wary eyes, telling the cook she had never felt watched so carefully by someone who outwardly seemed so deferential. In truth, Marcus adapted to the household with an ease that startled even Edmund. Within days, he organized the chaotic piles of correspondence that had long irritated the patriarch, managed schedules with near telepathic precision, and moved through the house with ghost-like efficiency. Guests at dinner parties quickly noticed him, unable to ignore the striking contrast between his refined manner and the rougher bearing of the other servants. Some marveled openly, others whispered theories behind gloved hands, and more than a few watched him with expressions that mixed intrigue with discomfort. The Dalton family's matriarch, Sarah Dalton, declared him magnificent. At one such gathering, while Victoria Cavendish observed him with a thin-edged skepticism that bordered on suspicion. She remarked that under different clothing one might mistake him for a gentleman, provoking murmurs across the table. Yet beneath these social intrigues, a deeper tension grew. Edmund, who prided himself on noticing the smallest irregularity, found himself troubled by the subtle inconsistencies in Marcus's history. Fletcher's claims seemed too convenient. The letter from Virginia curiously free of detail. The supposed former employer conveniently unreachable. His unease led him to send quiet inquiries to Richmond, seeking confirmation that never arrived. Marcus himself maintained a polite evasiveness whenever asked about his past, offering explanations that felt rehearsed, as though each word had been chosen with care to reveal nothing more than necessary. Charles, meanwhile, found his thoughts turning toward Marcus far more than propriety allowed. Something in the young man's calm intelligence drew him in, though he did not fully understand why. He went out of his way to speak with him, to observe him, to decipher whether the polished exterior concealed gratitude, resentment, or something entirely different. But Marcus rarely slipped. He mastered the art of revealing only what others wished to see. As weeks passed, a faint current of unease rippled through the household, invisible yet undeniable. Marcus worked flawlessly, behaved impeccably, and blended into the order of the estate with quiet precision, yet the very perfection of his conduct unsettled those who observed him closely. It felt less like genuine submission and more like a performance, one executed with the precision of someone waiting for the right moment to reveal a truth no one in the household was prepared to hear. Edmund Harrington's unease deepened steadily throughout the winter, though he concealed it behind his usual rigid composure, the sort of stoic front expected of a man who built his fortune through exact calculations and an intolerance for uncertainty. Yet every small irregularity in Marcus's behavior, every moment that suggested an education or upbringing incongruous with his supposed origins, pressed against Edmund's instincts, reminding him that something in the young man's presence did not align with the story presented on paper. The incongruities became especially apparent when Edmund invited two influential associates, Judge Mortimer Hale and Senator Langford Wexley, to the estate for an evening of brandy and private discussion. During the gathering, Marcus entered to serve refreshments, and both men paused, not merely because of his appearance, which was striking enough on its own, but because of the measured grace with which he moved, a refinement unusual even among trained house servants. Judge Hale observed him with narrowed eyes before remarking, with a tone too casual to be honest, that the young man carried himself like someone accustomed to reading rather than polishing silver. The senator offered a similarly pointed comment, prompting Edmund to deflect with forced humor, though he felt a chill settle along his spine. After the guests departed, Edmund paced the length of his study well past midnight, rereading the documents Fletcher had provided as though repetition might reveal a hidden truth between the lines. The ink was real, the seals authentic, yet something in the phrasing of the accompanying letter struck him as wrong, a politeness that felt artificial, a signature that lacked the personality expected of a long-term mistress writing about a trusted servant. He knew the slave markets were filled with forged papers, falsified birthplaces, constructed identities created to increase value, yet Marcus was different. There was too much precision in his gestures, too much self-possession in his silence. His posture when standing behind Edmund's chair, hands clasped lightly, eyes lowered with near-theatrical control, conveyed not fear but restraint of someone who had learned to survive by revealing nothing. Meanwhile, the household staff continued to exchange whispers that Marcus heard more than he let on. Bess reported finding him in rooms he had no reason to enter. The cook insisted he moved too quietly, appearing in doorways without warning. Thomas, the stable boy, swore Marcus had spoken to one of the horses with a tone so gentle and assured that the usually agitated mare had calmed instantly. These were small incidents, insignificant to any outsider, but together they formed a pattern that unsettled those who witnessed them. Charles, for his part, found his own fascination becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. He spent hours in Marcus's company under the guise of giving instructions or assessing his performance, but the truth ran deeper. He was drawn to the quiet intelligence in Marcus's eyes, the way he seemed to absorb information without being told, the way he observed every room with a careful, strategic awareness. Charles tried to dismiss these feelings as admiration for an exceptional servant, yet at night he found himself replaying every interaction, every conversation, every silent glance exchanged across the polished floors of the Harrington halls. One evening, after returning late from a meeting in town, Charles encountered Marcus in the downstairs corridor, standing perfectly still in the dim light of a lantern. For a moment, both men paused, shadow and flame flickering between them. Charles asked why he was awake at such an hour, and Marcus replied with a simple explanation. He was inspecting the locks, as instructed earlier that week. Yet something in his tone, calm and composed, suggested he was not merely fulfilling a task, but ensuring the security of something, or someone, he had not yet revealed. The unspoken tension of that moment lingered with Charles long after he retreated to his room. He sensed instinctively that Marcus carried a truth locked tightly behind his reserved exterior, a truth too heavy to hide forever. And while Charles felt drawn closer to that mystery, Edmund felt the opposite, a growing dread that whatever Marcus concealed would eventually break through the delicate order of their household, exposing vulnerabilities the Harringtons had long prided themselves on concealing. As the year drew toward spring, the family found themselves living in a house that outwardly maintained its polished routine, yet beneath that surface, cracks formed, hairline fractures invisible to those who did not know where to look. But the truth was waiting, patient and immovable, inching closer with every passing day, preparing to tear open the carefully constructed illusions upon which the Harrington family had built their sense of power. The first true fracture appeared during the Harringtons' annual winter gathering, a grand affair attended by the most influential families of Memphis, where the mansion glowed with candlelight and polished silver, and where ambition, envy, and rivalry mingled beneath the polite surface of conversation. Marcus moved through the crowd with his usual quiet precision, yet something about him drew more attention than ever before. Victoria Cavendish watched him with an expression so incisive, if it bordered on hostile, her gaze tracking him as one might follow a figure suspected of carrying a concealed weapon. She whispered to her husband that Marcus's bearing resembled that of a man raised among scholars, not servants, and her tone held an edge of accusation rather than admiration. Meanwhile, a visiting physician from New Orleans remarked privately that Marcus's posture and mannerisms were not learned by force, suggesting he had once lived freely. The murmurs reached Edmund's ears, igniting a slow, burning panic he concealed under the mask of a host determined to maintain appearances. Instead of addressing the concerns directly, he pulled Marcus aside and questioned him with a sharpness he had never used before. Marcus answered calmly, but the brief tension in his jaw told Charles, who watched from across the hall, that the interrogation had struck deeper than Edmund realized. The evening took a dramatic turn when Samuel Dalton, emboldened by too much brandy and a lifetime of unchecked arrogance, approached Marcus and demanded to know where he had been trained. He reached out, gripping Marcus by the chin, forcing him to look upward, a gesture meant to assert dominance, but which produced the opposite effect. The entire room felt the shift. Marcus did not recoil or tremble. Instead, he held Dalton's gaze with a calm, piercing steadiness that unsettled everyone who saw it. For a brief moment, it felt as if Dalton were the one being examined, measured, and dismissed. Dalton's wife gasped softly, and Edmund moved forward quickly, forcing a laugh, making excuses, diffusing the moment with the skill of a man who sensed disaster hovering nearby. Yet the damage had been done. In the days that followed, the Cavendish and Dalton households began whispering among themselves, convinced that something illicit or scandalous lay behind Marcus's presence in the Harrington home. Edmund's inquiries into Marcus's past intensified, but the more he searched, the more troubling the inconsistencies became. Records were missing, names did not match, locations contradicted one another. There was no coherent trail. At the same time, Charles's internal struggle grew more complex. He found himself unable to step away from the sense of connection he felt toward Marcus, an unexplainable pull that both frightened and fascinated him. He began seeking Marcus out deliberately, speaking with him late into the evenings under the guise of discussing household matters. During one such conversation, Charles noticed a faint scar near Marcus's collarbone, half hidden beneath his shirt, and when he asked about it, Marcus gave an answer so vague it felt like a deliberate misdirection. Charles pressed gently, and for the first time Marcus's composure faltered. His eyes softened, then hardened again, as though he were fighting an internal battle over whether to reveal the truth or continue suppressing it. Before Charles could question him further, Bess interrupted with an urgent message. Someone had arrived at the estate demanding to speak with Edmund. It was a woman, cloaked heavily, her face obscured, her voice trembling with something that sounded like restrained fury. She insisted she had traveled a long distance, that she carried information the Harringtons needed to hear, and that it concerned the young man called Marcus. When she uttered his name, Marcus, standing at the end of the hallway, froze, not in fear, but in recognition. It was the first unmistakable crack in his mask of calm, and the moment Charles realized that whatever truth Marcus had been hiding was not merely personal but powerful enough to draw people across states, powerful enough to threaten the fragile balance of the three ruling families of Memphis, and powerful enough to unravel everything the Harringtons believed they controlled. In the weeks that followed Edmund Harrington's growing suspicion, the quiet tension inside the estate took on a sharper shape, like a wire pulled too tightly beneath polished floorboards. Invisible yet impossible not to feel. Marcus continued performing his duties with flawless precision, yet Edmund watched him with a scrutiny that bordered on obsession, convinced that some hidden truth lay behind the young man's calm expression. He instructed the coachman to intercept any incoming mail from Virginia before it reached the general delivery table, hoping for a response to his discreet inquiries. But for over a month nothing came. Meanwhile, the Dalton and Cavendish households, long accustomed to competing with the Harringtons, began noticing that something had shifted. Word spread that the Harrington estate had acquired an attendant of unusual refinement, and though the slave markets had seen pretentious exaggerations before, the descriptions this time were consistent enough to command real curiosity. Sarah Dalton, known for her talent in gathering information others wished to keep private, privately sent her own inquiries to Virginia, determined to uncover the source of the Harringtons' newfound advantage. Victoria Cavendish, sharper and colder in her methods, instructed her husband's clerk to examine Fletcher's trade records, suspecting that any man who guarded a sale so fiercely must have been hiding something far more substantial than mere profit. Yet as rival families dug deeper, the first cracks appeared not outside the Harrington estate, but within it. One evening, just after the lamps had been lit, Bess, the housekeeper, entered Edmund's study to deliver a ledger and found him standing rigidly beside the window, fixated on the lawn below. The moon washed the grounds in thin white light, illuminating Marcus as he walked with his usual measured grace, carrying a stack of documents intended for the morning desk. But what froze Edmund was not Marcus's presence. It was the fact that the young man paused near the rose garden, slipped a hand inside his coat, and retrieved a folded piece of paper he had not been given. Marcus studied it briefly, his expression unreadable, then tucked it away again before continuing toward the servants' wing. Edmund said nothing to Bess, but fear, real fear, not suspicion, began to stir in him. He spent the night pacing, replaying the moment, wondering whether Marcus had intercepted correspondence meant for him or was communicating with someone outside the estate. The following morning, Charles Harrington noticed the change in his father's demeanor, but Edmund refused to discuss it. Charles, still captivated by Marcus in ways he tried to keep hidden even from himself, felt protective irritation rising. He did not want his father turning the house into a battlefield of suspicion. Yet Marcus remained as composed as ever, and it was precisely this unchanging calm that pushed Edmund from distrust into alarm. He began testing Marcus subtly, altering the timing of his instructions, leaving false notes on his desk, repositioning items in his study to see whether Marcus disturbed them. Each time, Marcus responded perfectly, revealing nothing, avoiding every trap as if he sensed the design behind them. It was during this escalating tension that an unexpected visitor arrived, Horace Pembroke, the attorney who had overseen the sale. He came unannounced, claiming he had returned to review a matter, but the stiffness in his face revealed deeper concerns. He confessed privately to Edmund that he had received an unsigned letter warning him to re-examine the documents Fletcher had provided. The moment he mentioned forged seals in recent regional transactions, Edmund felt the cold weight of dread settle across his shoulders. Charles overheard fragments of their conversation from the corridor, enough to realize that the danger surrounding Marcus was no longer imagined. Yet when Marcus entered the study later that afternoon to deliver Edmund's revised schedule, Charles saw something flicker, something fragile cross Marcus's expression, a momentary shadow of fear or exhaustion. It vanished instantly, replaced by the composed stillness that had defined him since the day he arrived. But Charles could not forget it. For the first time, he wondered whether the deception Edmund feared was not Marcus's doing at all, but the result of someone else's desperation, someone who had hidden a truth Marcus was carrying alone. Later that night, long after the house had quieted, a single letter arrived at the Harrington gates, hand-delivered by a rider who refused to give his name. The envelope bore no seal, only the faint scent of river damp and tobacco, but the handwriting on the front, elegant, deliberate, caused Edmund's breath to catch. It contained one sentence, nothing more: "You have something that was never meant to be sold." It was only then that Edmund understood the true danger had not yet begun. The night the Harrington estate's fragile calm finally broke began with a storm that swept across Memphis like an omen, rattling shutters, bending trees, and filling the air with the electric tension of something about to change. Rain hammered the roof with relentless force, and the wind carried a low howl that made even the servants glance nervously toward darkened windows, as though expecting figures to appear in the glass. Marcus moved through the mansion with his usual quiet precision, yet there was a tension in his posture unseen before, a coiled readiness that suggested he was no longer merely adapting to the Harrington household, but preparing for something that lay just beyond its walls. Edmund Harrington, who had spent the past week growing increasingly frustrated by the silence from Virginia regarding Marcus's background, sat in his study pacing before the fireplace, replaying every detail of the young man's arrival, Fletcher's confidence, the peculiar familiarity in Marcus's manner, and the unmistakable sensation that the household had welcomed not just a servant but a secret. Charles, too, found himself restless that night, wandering the halls unable to shake the feeling that something was shifting beneath the surface of the mansion's well-rehearsed order. He paused outside Marcus's door more than once, debating whether to knock, whether to ask him directly the questions that had been haunting him, yet each time he turned away, uncertain whether he feared the truth or longed for it. Meanwhile, in the servants' quarters, whispers spread like smoke. Bess insisted she had seen a figure near the stables earlier, someone who vanished the instant she called out. Another servant claimed the back gate had been left unlatched despite Marcus securing it hours before. No one dared voice their true suspicion, but the tension clinging to the air made even silence feel accusatory. Just after midnight, a harsh knocking echoed through the mansion, loud enough to pull everyone from their rooms. Edmund, startled, demanded to know who had come at such an hour in such dreadful weather, and when a trembling footman admitted that the visitor insisted on seeing the master immediately, Edmund strode toward the foyer with a mixture of irritation and dread. When the door swung open, rain swept in violently, soaking the marble floor, and standing just beyond the threshold was a woman whose presence seemed to sharpen the air. She was tall, cloaked, and soaked from the storm, but her posture held an authority that made even Edmund pause. Her eyes, sharp and burning with a resolve forged from suffering, scanned the interior of the mansion as though searching for something precious and stolen. She introduced herself not with deference, but with a calm certainty that startled Edmund, saying her name was Lillian and that she had come for her son. The words struck the foyer like a blow. Servants gasped. Charles froze, and Edmund, whose suspicions about Marcus's history had been growing daily, felt the floor tilt beneath him as realization surged through his mind. Lillian stepped inside without waiting for permission, her presence commanding the room in a way that no visitor, slave or free, had ever done. She spoke with the clarity of a woman who had rehearsed her truth countless times, who had vowed never to rest until she found the child taken from her years ago under circumstances that reeked of betrayal and broken promises. As she described the night Marcus was taken, the forged documents, the vanished traitor, the false claims of inheritance, even the storm outside seemed to quiet as though listening. Charles felt his heartbeat thundering, not from fear but from the sudden understanding that everything he believed about Marcus, the refinement, the intelligence, the unsettling calm, was not the mark of some mysterious rarity but the legacy of a mother who had fought the world to protect him. When Marcus appeared silently at the top of the staircase, drawn by the commotion, the moment crystallized. Lillian's breath caught. Marcus's expression shifted from practiced neutrality to something raw and unguarded, recognition stripped of every mask he had worn since entering the Harrington home. The entire household stood frozen as mother and son saw one another fully for the first time in years, the storm raging outside while a deeper storm gathered within the mansion's walls, threatening to tear apart not only the Harringtons' fragile power, but the entire fabric of Memphis society. Truth finally surfaced on a rain-soaked night when the Harrington estate, once a monument of pride and power, stood dim and subdued under the weight of secrets it could no longer contain. For weeks, Edmund Harrington's private inquiries had returned unsettling fragments that pointed to a story no one had imagined. The name on Marcus's bill of sale belonged to a woman who had been dead for 3 years. The seal had been stolen from a burned-down courthouse, and the supposed Virginia estate had ceased to exist after a fire that took both records and witnesses with it. More disturbing still was the quiet revelation that a wealthy abolitionist family had reported a missing son 2 years prior. A young man educated abroad, fluent in multiple languages, and known for a calm intelligence that unnerved even his tutors. The fragments did not align perfectly, but they aligned enough to make Edmund's hands tremble as he gathered the papers, understanding at last that the young man living under his roof was not a slave at all, but someone whose life had been violently interrupted, sold into a system where his refinement made him valuable but his silence made him dangerous. When he confronted Marcus in his study, expecting denial or fear, he instead found a man who had been waiting, patiently, quietly, calculating each move since the moment Fletcher delivered him. Marcus did not raise his voice. He simply told the truth Edmund had blinded himself to see. He had been taken in the night, drugged, transported across the border of 3 states, and sold under a false identity carefully crafted by Fletcher and a network of traders who specialized in erasing the lives of the well-born. Every polished gesture Marcus displayed had been deliberately maintained to remind himself of who he truly was, a silent rebellion against the chains forced upon him. Edmund's initial shock shifted to guilt, then to a trembling rage, not at Marcus, but at himself, at Fletcher, at the system he had upheld without question. He promised to help Marcus regain his freedom, to restore his name, but the promise came too late. The Dalton and Cavendish families, already suspicious and desperate to outmaneuver the Harringtons, had intercepted Edmund's inquiries and drawn their own conclusions, ones tainted by fear and greed. In the dead of night, they sent men to seize Marcus, believing he was a threat, an infiltrator, perhaps even a spy sent to dismantle their power. But Marcus had anticipated this, and with a quiet preparedness that revealed just how long he had been planning, he slipped from the estate using a hidden servant's path that led into the dense woods bordering the river. Charles awoke just in time to see the shadow of Marcus disappearing through the back gate, and without thinking he followed, driven by something deeper than obligation. They reached the riverbank where a lone skiff waited, its rope loosened as if positioned for this very moment. The moon cast a pale shimmer over the water as Marcus turned to Charles, not with gratitude nor with fear, but with a calm certainty that marked the end of everything they had known. He told Charles that remaining in Memphis meant certain death or enslavement again, that freedom required distance, anonymity, and an ocean between him and the men who trafficked in stolen lives. Charles, aching with a grief he had no language for, offered to help him reach the northern states, but Marcus refused. Any connection to the Harringtons would only place Charles in danger. Instead, he stepped into the boat with a quiet grace that felt like a farewell between two lives, not two men. By dawn he was gone, swallowed by the river's mist, leaving behind no clues except the empty rope and the faint impression of footsteps leading to the water. The scandal that followed destroyed the three ruling families of Memphis. Edmund's guilt consumed him. He withdrew from public life, leaving the estate to crumble beneath the weight of whispers. The Daltons and Cavendishes turned on one another, each blaming the other for the disastrous involvement that attracted federal scrutiny and exposed years of corrupt dealings. Within a decade, all three families were mere footnotes in Memphis history, their names spoken only as warnings of how greed can rot even the strongest dynasties. As for Marcus, no confirmed sighting ever emerged. Some claimed he restarted his life in France under a new name. Others insisted he joined abolitionist circles in Canada, using his education to dismantle the very network that tried to erase him. But Charles believed something simpler, that Marcus, once stripped of everything, chose a life that required no explanation, no past, no chains. And in the quiet moments of his later years, Charles often found himself watching the river, wondering if the man who slipped from Memphis like a ghost had ever glanced back, or if freedom meant never needing to.